My parents gave everything to my siblings and said, "You were never truly ours." Years later, I bought their family company. Make sure to subscribe our channel. It means a lot now. The story begins. The letter shook in my hands, the words blurring through tears. You were never truly ours. That was the last thing my mother wrote before transferring the entire family company to my siblings. I stood there in the empty hallway of our mansion, listening to their laughter from the dining room, as if I'd never existed. The house smelled of roasted turkey and betrayal. My father didn't look up when I walked past him. He just said, "You should be grateful we took you in at all." That night, I packed my bags and left. No name, no inheritance, no family. But pain has a strange way of planting seeds. Because 10 years later, I walked back into their company, not as their son, but as the man who bought every share they ever owned. And when they saw me at the boardroom table, silent and smiling, no one knew the storm had only begun. I grew up in a house where love was measured in money and attention was currency. My father, Charles Whitmore, built Whitmore Steel from nothing. A small workshop turned into a regional empire. He believed in legacy more than family and numbers more than hearts. My mother, Elaine, was the mirror image of his pride. Graceful, calculating, obsessed with appearances. Our mansion stood on a hill outside Dallas, surrounded by fields of silver metal and smoke from the factory chimneys. My older brother, Daniel, and sister, Grace, were raised to inherit everything: the company, the wealth, the name. I was simply there, like a shadow that no one cared to explain. From the start, I noticed the difference. Daniel wore new suits to dinner. I wore hand-me-downs. Grace had a piano teacher from New York. I had chores. But when I asked my mother why I didn't look like them, darker hair, sharper jawline, she would smile tightly and say, "Not everything in this family needs to be understood." Still, I loved them. Fiercely. I believed that if I studied harder, worked longer, and stayed quiet, one day my father would look at me the way he looked at Daniel, with pride. So I became his shadow. At 14, I followed him to the factory, taking notes on every deal, memorizing the hum of machines and the names of the workers who bowed when he passed. One night, I overheard two supervisors whispering by the conveyor line. "Whitmore's youngest isn't his," one said. "The boys from that affair years ago. Elaine just raised him to keep the scandal quiet." Their laughter cut sharper than the steel they forged. When I told my mother what I'd heard, she froze. Her voice dropped to a whisper that chilled my spine. "You will never repeat that, do you understand? You should be grateful you even have our name." Her eyes said it all. The rumor wasn't a lie. After that, home stopped feeling like home. At every dinner, my siblings spoke about the future of the company, about legacy, about expansion. And every time I tried to join, my father would silence me. "This is family business, son," he'd say. "Maybe you'll find your own path someday." So I did. While Daniel studied finance in New York and Grace traveled through Europe, I worked at the factory floor under a false name. The men there didn't know I was a Whitmore. They knew me as Cal, the new hand who fixed broken engines and stayed late every night. And for the first time, I felt seen. Old Ben, the senior foreman, once told me, "Blood don't make you family, boy. Loyalty does. Remember that." Those words stuck with me more than any lesson from my parents. Years passed. When father retired, the company held a grand celebration. Daniel gave a speech, Grace played piano, and mother smiled like a queen. When my turn came to speak, my father raised a hand. "There's no need for that," he said quietly. "You've done enough." The guests laughed politely. I stood there humiliated, my heart pounding in my chest. That night, as the music faded and the lights dimmed, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the glass, a stranger with my father's eyes but none of his name. I realized something then. Family could strip you of everything, but it could also teach you how to rebuild. The year my father fell ill, the house grew quieter than ever. Meetings turned into arguments, laughter into whispers. By then, Daniel had already taken over the company's operations, and Grace managed its finances. I wasn't invited to any meetings, but I still showed up, sitting at the far end of the boardroom, taking notes no one asked for. Father would barely look at me anymore. He had grown frail, his once commanding voice now a whisper. One evening he called all of us into his study. The air was thick with perfume, whiskey, and the faint sound of rain hitting the glass. The lawyer sat by the fireplace, papers spread across the mahogany desk. When the will was read, it didn't shock me. Not completely. Daniel inherited 60% of Whitmore Steel. Grace received 30%. And I received nothing. The lawyer hesitated before reading the last line. Charles Whitmore wishes to acknowledge that Caleb Whitmore was not biologically his child, and therefore not entitled to inheritance under family law. The words hung in the air like a funeral bell. My mother wouldn't meet my eyes. Grace shifted uncomfortably, and Daniel smirked as if the world had finally been set right. I stood up, my hands trembling. After everything I've done, after every year I spent working for him, my father raised his frail hand. You should be grateful we took you in, Caleb. You were never truly ours. Something inside me shattered, but I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just walked out. It was raining outside, the kind of cold rain that burns on the skin. As the gates closed behind me, I looked back once, at the house where I'd lived my whole life, and swore I'd never return until they remembered my name. I moved to Houston with two things, an old truck and a heart full of fury. I worked day and night, taking whatever job I could find, repairing engines, hauling steel, delivering shipments for the same companies that once bowed to my father's name. For months, I slept in the back of that truck. But something in me refused to die. Every insult, every closed door became a lesson. I watched, listened, learned. When I found an old contact from the factory, Ben, the foreman who once believed in me, he gave me my first break. Start your own contracting business, he said. You know this industry better than anyone, so I did. I registered a small company, Caltech Industries, using the little money I had saved. I worked 16-hour days, sleeping in the workshop, eating cold sandwiches while welding machines by hand. Slowly, clients came. 1, then 2, then 10. I didn't just survive. I built. 3 years later, Caltech was supplying machinery parts to half the state's construction firms. My father's old employees, and men who once ignored me, started reaching out for contracts. And I made them sign under my new name. They never knew who I was. Then came the fire. One night, I got a call. Whitmore Steel's central plant had burned down. Insurance couldn't cover the losses. Years of mismanagement had left the company drowning in debt. Daniel was struggling to keep it afloat. Grace had married into another family, distancing herself from the chaos. I should have felt satisfied. But instead, I saw an opportunity. Through a network of quiet investments and shell companies, I began buying Whitmore stock. Quietly, strategically. Every time the value dropped, I bought more. It took me 5 years, one sleepless decade of sacrifice, but I never stopped. By the time Daniel realized what was happening, Caltech Industries had quietly acquired a controlling interest in Whitmore Steel, and the day the papers finalized, I sat in my office, older, stronger, untouchable, holding the same letter that once broke me. You were never truly ours, I smiled. They were right. I never belonged to them, because I was meant to outgrow them. I thought owning the company would heal me. But the night I signed those papers, silence filled my office like a ghost. For years, I'd dreamed of this victory, yet it felt hollow. I poured a drink and opened my laptop. In the old Whitmore archives, buried under decades of ledgers and property deeds, I found a file labeled Project Orville, Confidential. Inside was a photograph. A young woman, dark-skinned, standing beside my father at a factory groundbreaking. Her eyes were warm, her smile tired. On the back, in faded ink, were 5 words. For our son, Caleb Orville. My breath caught. My hands shook as I scrolled through the documents, letters, transactions, and one signed confession from Charles Whitmore himself. He had bought out a smaller steel company in the 1980s, Orville Metals, run by a man named Samuel Orville. Samuel died mysteriously during negotiations. A few months later, my mother gave birth to me, that woman in the picture. She wasn't just a stranger. She was my real mother, Samuel's wife. It wasn't just betrayal. It was theft of a life. My father had destroyed a man's company, taken his wife in secret, and raised their child as his own shame. The truth hit like steel to the chest. I wasn't disowned for not being theirs. I was erased because I was the reminder of what my father had stolen. I couldn't sleep that night. I drove for hours until I found myself parked outside the old Whitmore mansion. Lights glowed in the windows. Inside, my mother sat alone at the piano, her hands trembling over the keys. When she saw me through the glass, her eyes widened in shock. I walked in without a word. "Caleb," she whispered, "you shouldn't be here." I placed the photograph on the piano. "You lied to me my whole life." Tears filled her eyes, but her voice remained calm. Too calm. "Your real father was a good man. I loved him once. But Charles, he found out. He would have ruined everything. I had no choice." "No choice?" I said bitterly. "You let him destroy a man's name, take his company, and raise his son like a secret?" She looked down at the keys. "You have his eyes," she murmured. "Samuel always said one day, you'd build something greater than any of us. And you did." For the first time, I saw her not as the woman who had humiliated me, but as a prisoner of her own silence. I left without another word, but the image of her weeping at the piano stayed with me. All those years I spent chasing revenge, I hadn't realized I was walking in my real father's footsteps, rebuilding what had been stolen from him. That night, I changed everything. No longer Caleb Whitmore, the unwanted son. I signed my next contract as Caleb Orville, rightful heir of the man my father betrayed. The Whitmore Steel boardroom looked different now. It wasn't the grand room of my childhood memories, where my father used to sit like a king and I like a shadow. Now I sat at the head of the table, the company logo glimmering behind me like poetic justice carved in metal. Reporters lined the hallway. My siblings, Vanessa and Luke, stood at the far end of the room with folded arms, their smugness slowly draining as lawyers handed them the acquisition documents. "This is a joke, right?" Vanessa snapped. Luke scoffed. "How could you afford this?" I smiled, calm and deliberate. "I didn't afford it. I built it." Behind me, the press cameras clicked as I continued. "My tech firm, Orville Innovations, now owns 68% of Whitmore Steel's shares. Effective immediately, I'm the new CEO." The color drained from Vanessa's face. She turned to the old man at the end of the table, my father, Charles Whitmore, frail now, his once booming voice replaced by short, wheezing breaths. "Dad, do something," she hissed. But he didn't. He looked at me, really looked at me, maybe for the first time in his life. "Orville?" he whispered. The name stung his tongue like acid. "Yes," I said softly. "The name you tried to bury." I slid the photograph across the table, the one of him standing beside Samuel Orville and the woman he stole. The silence that followed was suffocating. Vanessa's hand trembled. "What is this?" "It's the truth," I said. "The truth you were all shielded from. Your father didn't just build Whitmore Steel, he stole it. And I'm the living proof of that theft," Luke's voice cracked. "You're lying." "Then ask him," I said, turning to the man who'd built his empire on silence. Charles stared at the photo for what felt like eternity. When he finally spoke, his words came out in fragments. Samuel was stubborn. He wouldn't sell. I had debts. The company was drowning. I made a choice. He coughed, his frail hands gripping the table. "Your mother, she—" "Stop," I cut him off. "You made a choice, yes, and so did I," Vanessa stepped forward. "You can't just erase our family legacy." I leaned forward. "Erase it?" "No, I'm reclaiming it. The name, the legacy, the dignity you all threw away when you told me I wasn't truly yours." For a moment, the only sound in the room was my father's labored breathing. He looked at me with something like regret, the kind that comes too late. "Caleb, I was trying to protect this family. By destroying another?" I asked. He didn't answer. He didn't have to. His silence was confession enough. When the press conference ended, the headlines hit within hours. "Disowned son reclaims empire. Whitmore Steel acquired by Orville Innovations." Social media exploded with images of me standing beside the Whitmore logo, the word Orville engraved beneath it in bold silver. But my victory felt heavier than I imagined. That night, as the city lights flickered below my office window, I received a call from the family estate. "Your father's asking for you," the housekeeper said softly. "He doesn't have much time." For a long while I said nothing. Then I grabbed my coat and drove through the rain, headlights slicing through the mist like ghosts. The mansion was quiet when I arrived, just the low hum of machines and the scent of antiseptic in the air. I found him in his study, surrounded by photos of his golden years, board meetings, ribbon cuttings, smiling faces that hid too much truth. He looked small in that hospital bed. The once towering man who commanded respect now lay trembling beneath white sheets. When he saw me, his eyes softened. You came. I came to finish what you started, I said, voice steady. He tried to speak, but his words broke into coughs. You were never supposed to know. But I did, I said. And I turned your crime into my creation. He nodded faintly, tears gathering in his eyes. Your mother loved you, he whispered, even when she couldn't show it. I know, I said quietly. She told me before you did. He stared at me for a long time. I was wrong. I leaned closer. About what? About you, he breathed. You weren't a mistake. You were the price of my greed. His eyes closed slowly. For the first time in years, I didn't feel anger. Just sorrow. For the boy who wanted love, and the man who built walls instead. When the heart monitor fell silent, I stood there for a moment, letting the weight of it all sink in. Then I turned to the window. The dawn was breaking, soft gold spilling across the horizon, melting the cold edges of the night. I whispered to no one in particular, "It's over." The next morning, I announced the company's new name, Orville and Whitmore, Steel for the Future, not out of mercy, but legacy. Because revenge burns fast, but redemption endures. A month after my father's funeral, I returned to the steel plant, the same one where I used to sweep floors as a teenager, hiding from my family's shame. Now the workers greeted me with respect. Some nodded silently, others smiled. The air smelled of iron and heat, but this time it didn't feel heavy. It felt alive. I walked through the factory floor, touching the cold beams, remembering every insult, every locked door. Every night I prayed for someone to call me son. At the far end of the hall stood the new company sign, Orville and Whitmore, built on truth. Below it, a small plaque, dedicated to the families we wronged and the ones who rose again. For the first time in years, I smiled, not the smirk of revenge, but the calm of peace. Outside, the sun broke through the clouds, scattering gold across the steel structures. I thought of my mother, her quiet strength, her secret kindness, the way she'd touch my hair and whisper, "One day you'll understand." Now I did. Revenge gave me power, but forgiveness gave me freedom. I didn't rebuild Whitmore Steel to destroy my family. I rebuilt it to rebuild myself. And as the wind carried the sound of machinery and morning light painted the city in hope, I realized I was never truly theirs, yes, but I was always meant to be me. Sometimes being rejected is the only way to discover who you truly are. Because family doesn't end where betrayal begins, it begins where truth finally stands.